and privileged to introduce John McLaughlin. He is the Distinguished Practitioner in Residence in the Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University. One of our more colorful leaders at CIA, Ted Price, once said, by way of distinguishing between operations officers and analysts, that operations officers were fighter pilots and analysts were poets. John McLaughlin is one of those rare breeds who is both a fighter pilot and a poet. John started his professional life in Vietnam as a soldier, worked his way up the ranks of CIA from the Office of Current Intelligence, which was a red-hot office in the DDI, as an analyst on Soviet foreign policy, eventually becoming deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency and for a time acting director. No easy task or no small accomplishment, and it speaks to the man. John is a former colleague. He is a thinker, an educator, an analyst, a commentator, and a strategist. And I'm honored to present him to you today. John?
Thanks so much, Dick. That was a very gracious introduction and blessedly brief, don't you think? I was speaking down in, I think it was Montgomery, Alabama, a few months ago, and the person had my complete biography. I mean, just went through every unit I had ever worked in, and it went on for about 15 minutes. And he grew more and more and more excited as he went along. I think he'd never met a CIA person. What would he do here, for God's sake? And at the end of it, he said, and now it's my honor to present a man with a truly extinguished career. I felt all right about that. It's okay. I'm still working. So I said to a number of you here today, there are many people here that I have nothing to teach you. We have, looking at this audience with Burton and Dick and Joe and scholars back there like Roy and Spike here, who used to bring me big thick packages at 2 o'clock in the morning and said, just say sign here from the FBI, warrants if you will. This is an audience where we could simply have a discussion. But Dick has asked me to make some remarks about this very tricky subject of intelligence challenges for a new administration. And of course, I've thrown out part of what I wanted to say in light of the events of the last week, but we'll get to that. I think I also struggled a bit with the question of whether we should be talking about substantive challenges the new administration will face, because as several of you just said to me a few minutes ago, intelligence is today involved in every single one of the issues that are driving national security, or whether we should talk about problems that I would say are sort of inside the intelligence beltway, things that intelligence people talk about. That'd be pretty boring, actually. So I'm going to do a little bit of that, but we'll talk about substantive issues and also some of the things that are driving intelligence. So, you know, intelligence only exists for one reason. At the end of the day, it's to help the United States navigate in a very difficult world. And I would say for a new administration, one of the things it will have to learn is how to navigate in what I might call the strategic dark. The strategic dark. Why do I call it that? Because throughout our history, we've always had some concept that has driven us strategically. And Americans like that to be pretty simple. So, you know, it might have been in our distant past, preserve the Union, or make the world safe for democracy in the early part of the last century, or defeat the Nazis. We can all get that. Or in the period that many of us went through, the Cold War, the idea of contain the Soviet Union. There was more to it than that, but that was a simple concept that most people could grasp. I'm not aware of a concept like that today, that everyone, if you woke them up at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, what's our strategic purpose here as a country, as a generator of foreign policy, most people would have different ideas or no idea. I ask my graduate students this every year. I say, what era are we in? And I challenge them to go out and write the kind of article that George Kennan wrote in the late 40s that gave us containment. The best I've heard so far is that we're in the era of asymmetry and lawlessness. Asymmetry because of what happened in Paris last week. That is, we're in a time when a small number of people can do an enormous amount of damage without a terrible amount of effort, mobilizing great nations in the way that attack presumably will mobilize us. Lawlessness, because that's what's represented there, but lawlessness we see in everything from Putin's invasion of Crimea and Iraq, which broke at least 3 treaties that Russia had signed about inviolability of borders, to what China is doing in the South China Sea, which is challenging, in that case, maritime freedom of the seas, by building an island 500 miles from the Chinese mainland, when law of the sea indicates that you only have rights to 12 miles off your coast. And in the East China Sea, challenging maritime law by saying this is an exclusive identification zone where others have to notify us when they fly in. Now, of course, the United States has challenged all of these things, and no one is sitting still. But nonetheless, the basic, for lack of a better term, rules that comprise what we think of as world order are all sort of under threat. So a new administration has to figure out how do they work their way through that. You know, one way to see the challenges for a new administration, the intelligence challenges, is to just stop and think about how this is different from the Cold War. That's the sort of last time we had kind of a fixed universe that we could define with confidence. So in thinking about that, you know, back then, 60% of intelligence effort was on the Soviet Union. It was the reason you cared about other parts of the world. Well, today, the number of countries and problems you have to pay attention to has multiplied dramatically, so that we now have to look down to the tribal and municipal level in countries that back then we would not have paid a great deal of attention to. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that, second contrast that tells us something about today, I think, is that back then, secrets were hard to get, but we kind of knew where to look for them, and we benefited in some cases by walk-ins who were very productive. Today, maybe the secrets we most want are somewhere on the Afghan-Pakistan border, or on the now erased border between Syria and Iraq, in tribal areas. You're not going to meet these people at embassy cocktail parties, and very few of them are going to walk in. So the challenge of getting secrets is much greater today than it was. Not to minimize the difficulty in the Cold War. Also back then, you know, we had the luxury of looking mainly for very big things in the world, a motorized rifle division on the German border, or bombers or submarines. Today, we have to look for a bomb in a suitcase, one person in a city of 17 million people. Look what the French are going through now. So the size and precision of our targeting has changed dramatically, and is in a way, I think, much more labor intensive. We never had enough data back then. That was a big issue. Today we have too much, and just dealing with data has become a problem. I don't know whether many of you know, but a study I did in 2010 for the then director of National Intelligence Denny Blair, was to look back at the Christmas bomber of 2009, but we did that in the first 6 months of 2010. I don't know whether you know, a few people, but it was quietly declassified a couple of weeks ago. And it's by the as a result of a Freedom of Information request from the Federation of American Scientists. So it's on their website. It's heavily redacted, as you would expect, but some of the things come through, and one of our conclusions about why we missed that attack, that attempted attack. This individual was going to attempt to bring down a Northwest airline with about 200 plus people on it over Detroit, the underwear bomber. He failed because his detonator didn't work, and some passengers overcame him when his underwear began to smoke. How else could I put it? But one of the things we discovered is that if you knew where the 10 reports are and you lined them up on a table and you looked at them, you would have detected this and known it was coming. But those reports were buried in literally thousands of messages that had come about largely as a result of intelligence successes in acquiring information. So this problem of volume is not to be dismissed lightly. It goes right to the heart of the greatest enemy of intelligence, which is surprise. Surprises are concealed in volume. And then, of course, back then, we didn't have to share much data with people. You know, we had to share it with a few trusted partners and a few trusted intelligence services. But today, look what we're having to do in the aftermath of 9/11 or the Paris attacks. We need essentially a worldwide coalition of data sharing in order to deal with those things. So that's sort of the world that we confront today and that any new administration will confront on the intelligence side. We have to look at all of this data and all of this volume with a skeptical mind. We have to challenge conventional wisdoms. My best joke about, my most revealing joke about analysts is this, and it kind of illustrates what I'm trying to say. We have to think like this person. So an analyst and a lawyer are on a train. They're going through the countryside, and they look out and they see a field of sheep. It's very warm. It's July. And the lawyer says, "Look at those sheep. They've been shorn." And the analyst says, "Yes, on this side." That's it, folks. In other words, a certain skeptical turn of mind that always questions what you're seeing and doesn't trust exactly what your eyes present to you. So to cope with all of this, a new administration and intelligence together are going to have to do a couple things. First, they're going to have to look at the world and do the hardest thing you have to do in intelligence, which cannot do everything. You're going to have to establish priorities. Now, working with Bob Gates years ago, I was struck by his method of establishing priorities. Bob said to me once, "The best way to do this is to draw concentric circles and then to put the most urgent things you have to deal with in that inner circle, and then to move out from there." I said, "Well, what are the categories for these circles?" "Well, that most inner circle we'll call urgent. The next circle out we'll call important. The next circle out we'll call emerging. And the next circle out we'll call maintenance." Okay? So what would we put in those circles? Let's go to the inner circle, urgent. And the criteria there has to be things that threaten the lives of Americans or the physical security of the United States or our allies. Well, pretty easy to answer that question, particularly this week. The Paris events show us, once again, the danger of terrorism. But I want to emphasize here, let's just talk about Paris for a moment. So much could be said, so much is being said, but let's pick out a few things that we could observe about these attacks and about the perpetrators. You know, without saying anyone missed something, I think no one should really be surprised that ISIL showed the capabilities it did in Paris. Because we have known for a year or more, it's been apparent for a year or more, that this is a group that has at least 5 advantages and strengths that Al-Qaeda never had. First, it has a strategy. I don't know whether you're familiar with work done at the Institute for the Study of War. I recommend something they did that talked about the strategy of ISIS consisting, once again, of 3 rings. An inner ring, that's what we're seeing in Syria, Iraq, Jordan, that neighborhood. A near abroad ring, which consists of the rest of the Middle East, with their hub being in Libya, where they have a serious base, if you will, in Sirte. And an outer ring, which consists of the United States, Europe, South Asia, parts of Asia. So they have a conscious strategy, and they have different objectives in each of these rings. So they have that strategy. Second, they have, as we all know quite vividly, territory. Al-Qaeda never had territory. They rented some in Afghanistan for a while, but other than what some of their affiliates were able to do, as in Yemen, they never held territory or sought to govern it in any meaningful way. These guys have, by various measures, somewhere between 1/3 and half of Syria and Iraq. And there, they can plan the kind of things they just did in Paris. They have the thing you can never let. What we always said about terrorism after 9/11 is to defeat it, you need to do 3 things. Destroy the leadership, deny it safe haven, and change the conditions that give rise to the phenomenon. Let's put that third one aside. That third one is too hard for intelligence to do. That's an all-government multinational. But destroy the leadership, deny them safe haven. Well, we've hit some of their leaders, but they've got a deep bench, and that safe haven is there. Now, we're attacking it today. I think the Russians today may flatten Raqqa. I'm not sure whether that's good or bad. In fact, I heard General McCaffrey this morning say on television that he's starting to feel a little bad for Syria because everyone's bombing it.
Yeah.
And Russians don't bomb that precisely. To my knowledge, they've only got 4 aircraft in theater that have the capability to do PGM, precision-guided munitions. So one of the reasons they do so much bombing is that they drop heavy bombs through clouds without much concern for collateral damage. And one of the reasons our bombing has been so discreet is that we don't do that. So we'll have to see when dust clears what's left of Raqqa, with both the French and the Russians pounding it. So territory, they've got that territory, and in ways that the Al-Qaeda never did. They have money. Now, we have underestimated, I think, the effect of the fact that they have, I heard a Treasury official say publicly, somewhere between, no one knows, but somewhere between 500 million and $1 billion. Okay, I remember intercepting letters from Al-Qaeda in which they were begging people for money. In fact, at one point, the deputy leader, Zawahiri, was sending a letter to the then leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, asking for, as I recall, about $100,000. They're broke. These guys have a lot of money. What does money enable them to do? They can send people. They can hire expertise. Where do you think these slick videos come from? They can train. Now, they used to have to use some of that money to govern. That's another issue. But at the same time, the money enables them to do a lot of things. They have access. That's the 4th thing. The last count I was able to find reliably was that they have about 4,500 Westerners amidst their somewhere around 30,000 fighters. And by the way, the number of their fighters doesn't go down because by all accounts, they're adding about 1,000 a month. So that stays relatively stable. But with that, Al-Qaeda never had anything like that access. Western passports, that's of course how Paris came about. They can move freely within the West and certainly within the European Union among countries because of the Schengen Agreement, which permits free movement across borders. So they've got that. they've got a narrative. Why do I emphasize that? Well, if you look at their propaganda, it's impressive if you are an alienated young person living in a part of Berlin or Paris or Prague where you feel you don't belong, or Amsterdam or Brussels. It depicts a life. I've actually seen one depiction of the car, swimming pool, wife, and driveway you'll have. And you don't have to be a fighter. You can be a toll taker, a hospital worker, a utilities worker. This is the propaganda. It doesn't work out that way, as we learned from some studies that have been done by returnees, but that's what people think they're getting into. In 1 month this summer, 900 propaganda messages coming out of ISIS. Only 2% of them involved anything like the brutality we've seen. That's what we see. We see the brutality in their videos. The rest of them were about quality of life issues or military training you would get. Very little emphasis on the ugly brutality in their propaganda messages. So they've got a narrative that exceeds anything. I go through all of this to say, this is the challenge we're up against. It's really tough. And finally, they have some rudimentary experience in governing. They're actually trying to run some of these areas. Now, again, you get conflicting reports. People don't love this administration. There are reports of people who say it's better than the alternative. There are reports from people who say there's less corruption and bribery. They pick up the trash. There's rudimentary experience in governing, maybe governing at a just barely tolerable level. So those are some of the advantages they have. And this is all embedded in a Middle East. For those of you who follow the Middle East, I'd be curious to know if you agree, a Middle East that's now much more complicated than anything I remember working on in my career. Think about it. The Middle East is now conflicted on at least 4 or 5 dimensions. Persian versus Arab, Sunni versus Shia, more broadly than just Persian versus Arab. Modernizer versus traditionalist, people who are trying still to realize the aspirations they had in the brief Arab Spring. Terrorist versus regimes. And interestingly, terrorist versus terrorism. Because if you look at the conflict now underway, you've got Al-Qaeda affiliates seeking to gain some strength in the shadow of ISIL's success, and you have a clash between the Al-Qaeda groups, ISIL and al-Nusra, and the Shia group, Hezbollah, supported by Iran. So you've got terrorists against terrorists. So it's all embedded in a very difficult, complex environment. Well, what about Paris? Much could be said specifically, and it's all being said as we sit here on some network. But let me just mention a couple things about Paris. What are some of the things the realities we have to think about when we try and think about how we respond to the challenge that ISIS has presented us with? Well, time matters. And most of our timetables have slipped. Back in April, we said we would be organizing, we meaning Iraq, and we would be organizing an offensive to retake Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq. That's nowhere. There's other cities like Ramadi, Fallujah. Those offensives are stalled, even though Ramadi appears to be one that people talk about all the time, but it's just stalled. More could be said, but I'll leave it at that. The longer we leave them in place, the deeper their roots and the more resigned people come to having them around in the areas where they are, the Sunni areas in particular. This may be one of the reasons for frustration with the President's remarks yesterday. I don't want to be his critic here, but the way I felt about it was I understand what he's saying. He's an intelligent man. There's a certain logic to it. He's careful. He doesn't want to get caught in a quagmire. That's all very persuasive. On the other hand, time is passing, and it's hard to hear what he said as truly persuasive as a strategy against what we're facing here. Of course, he challenges people to say, what would you do? So we'll talk about that a little bit. Many people have talked about that. But time matters. Large powers are going to have to reconcile their differences. You cannot have a settlement without something that the United States, Russia, and Iran agree to. That's my view. I don't think you can checkmate those guys. I don't think you can push them aside. You can't say you have no interests here, they have interests there. And that's what's going on in Vienna, which may be one of the most important aspects of this struggle. There, the one thing that I think, and who's in Vienna? 19 countries. That's impressive. Think of the, wouldn't you love to fly in that room with around one table, United States, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. Remember, Saudi Arabia and Iran are very much at loggerheads in the region. Saudi Arabia's principal concern, I worry, is not so much ISIS as the fact that Iran is, in their view, seeking to dominate the region. So that, but all of these disparate interests have to somehow find a convergence. The one thing I can think that they could converge on is this. I don't think any one of them, not Saudi Arabia, not Iran, not Russia, certainly not the United States, wants another failed state in the heart of the Middle East. By failed state, I mean a Libya-like situation, which is the direction that Syria is going, where there's complete chaos, complete disorder, militias fighting militias, and no one in charge. Or, in the worst case, a black flag, an ISIS flag flying over Damascus. No one wants that. So that's the one thing I think our diplomats have to work with there that can give them some traction. A third thing you've got to do is meet Sunni grievances. 70% of Syria to get a settlement. 70% of Syria is Sunni, about 25% of Iraq. In Iraq, the al-Abadi government has a reform program that has not worked. The Shia are fighting it. Bottom line here is the tribes, the Sunni tribes who are now sitting in areas controlled by ISIS are not yet prepared to cooperate or come together in a unified Iraqi government. Okay? So, over in Syria, I would argue that the principal magnet for foreign fighters, pulling them into Syria, is the aggrieved Sunni population there, which for years has felt abused and excluded by an Alawite majority represented by the Assad government. Until that changes, people are going to keep showing up there. So there's a political dimension to any settlement that has to be dealt with. Now, General Petraeus said something, I encourage people to look at his testimony back in September, said something I certainly agree with, which is, and by the way, I'm testifying in the House Armed Services Committee tomorrow, so I'm thinking about all this stuff from that point of view. General Petraeus said, everyone says there's no military solution to this. You can't kill your way out of it. But there has to be a military component to it. Okay? So that's you've got the political component, but you need the military component. So what have I said? Time matters, large powers have to reconcile, Sunni grievances have to be met. And my final point would be, reluctantly, air power is probably not enough. Now, air power, perhaps we haven't applied it as decisively as we can or as precisely as we can. So, look, we can all be surprised here. Air power can do a lot of things. It can disrupt. It can destroy. It can demoralize. One of the things, maybe I'm colored a lot by my experience in Vietnam. That's a long time ago in a different kind of war. But I remember there were parts of Third Corps Tactical Zone where I worked that were literally, if you plotted them on a map, literally covered every inch with B-52 strikes. But those guys were still there. A lot of these were in the area that we later discovered to be riddled with tunnels up around Cu Chi. So we have different kind of air power today. I mean, a B-2 can deliver 16 2,000-pound bombs with precision on laser-guided targets in one pass. No one could do that back then. So maybe air power will do more than I think, but I believe this is going to come down to needing, for lack of a better term, more boots on the ground. Now, how does that happen? No one is going to send another massive American force to the Middle East. But, again, drawing on things that people like Petraeus and others have said, you could increase substantially the special operator population there and give them greater empowerment to go forward with troops and to do what we did in Afghanistan after we sent in 2 teams after 9/11, where CIA officers were mixed with special forces people who could laser designate targets up close. Again, a different situation. The Taliban did not have an air force. But if you put those people up forward, they can do a lot more damage than they can as advisors in the rear. Very interesting suggestion yesterday by former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, Jim Stavridis, who is now Dean of the Fletcher School up at Tufts. Remember, he's NATO commander. His idea was that France has every right to invoke Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which is the collective defense article, requiring all 28 members to, 27 other members to come to the assistance of whoever has been attacked. And Stavridis said, we should really consider this. This is a legitimate out-of-area operation. It doesn't mean, again, a 50,000 person NATO force descending on Syria, but it certainly can mean NATO provision of special operations forces, training, augmentation of the air campaign, and we can't settle this here, but some specialists would have to talk about it, some augmentation of the ground force. So all of those things come out of the sense of urgency that we all feel about this, that something has to be done. Isn't that what most of you feel at this point? We can talk about it in just a moment when I stop and we have a discussion, but I think those are some of the things that could be considered, and that's the magnitude of the challenge we're up against. And the bottom line, if there is one, is Sunnis have to be satisfied, and you have to take back ISIL territory so that they don't seem 10 feet tall and their narrative is not powerful and they really don't have a caliphate. Nothing else will work. So let's move on from that. That's the inner circle, and one could put a lot of other things in that inner circle of priorities and concerns. One could put cyber in there, one could put electromagnetic pulse in there, one could put major weapon systems in there. But let's take a circle out and go to countries like that are certainly important, like let's say Iran and North Korea. Let's talk about them for a minute. And I see I'm at 45 minutes, so I'm going to wrap this up in about 10. Iran. There's a huge challenge for the intelligence community here, right? Because we will be, I guess I can say we here, be responsible for monitoring whether Iran is cheating or not. To me, it's controversial, I know, but to me, it's not a bad agreement. It's a compromise. I mean, they've given something, we've given something, and I have confidence in the intelligence. We're good at detecting cheating. Experience in arms control tells me that. So that'll be our job. Much could be said about this, but an Israeli friend of mine put it pretty well. He said, this is a former senior intelligence official in Israel. It's kind of surprised me because he was a little different than Netanyahu on this. He said, I see 3 scenarios. The first, and this is the order of least likelihood, all right? So least likely first. There could be a transformation in Iran, as clearly our administration hopes. Could be. It's within the realm of plausibility. So I've talked to a lot of journalists who've spent a lot of time in Iran. They're the ones who go there most frequently. And the consensus I hear is, you know, it's probably the most pro-American country in the region, on the street at least. Not the regime, but people you bump into on the street. 40% of their university graduates are women. 60% of the people in Iran have grown up since the revolution. If they get some benefit from this agreement, there will be parliamentary elections in February. Rouhani's faction could increase its strength somewhat. Rouhani is, I've learned not to say moderate in connection with Iranian, but Rouhani is among the Iranians in power someone who wasn't supposed to be in power. In other words, they control the number of people who get into a presidential election. So if you look at the presidential election, as I think Tom Friedman said, and you looked at the candidates, there was Mr. Black, Mr. Black, Mr. Black, Mr. Black, and Mr. White. Mr. White won. Rouhani. So the guy who was probably least likely to win in terms of the candidates the regime okayed was the guy who won. So, second scenario, getting more likely, the North Korean scenario, where they're caught cheating and they pull out and the clock starts over again. Third scenario, probably most likely in my Israeli friend's view, strategic patience by Iran. That is, they play by the rules, they do everything they're supposed to do, they get their sanctions lifted, they continue to do low-level research with low-level centrifuges, and at the end of 15 years, they build their nuclear weapons. That could happen. That presumes no big change in Iran. So I just throw those out there as scenarios to think about. And maybe the most important thing in it is it's not hopeless. It may lead to something good, but remember what I said earlier about skepticism. North Korea. Weirdest regime on the face of the earth. A friend of mine has gone there a number of times in a people-to-people type capacity. Has told me stories like his minder, his translator, after getting to know each other for several days in quiet walks out on the street away from the surveillance, would say things like, you know, when we all cry in the streets and because of something sad that's happened in our country, my brother has had some of the military police come up to him and say, cry harder. So there are people in North Korea who realize, and we have country's leading expert right here, Joe Dutrani, who realize that they're not completely cut off, I guess is my point. But it is nonetheless the vestige of Stalinism that exists in the world. 4 worries about North Korea. Nuclear. They've done 3 nuclear tests in the last 7 years. The yields are getting a little greater each time. The head of Northcom, Stratcom, one of our principal military leaders in this country, has said publicly that he thinks they now have the ability to mate a nuclear warhead to a missile. So nuclear, bad. Missiles. They've been working since the mid-90s on an intercontinental ballistic missile. They have yet to master, as far as I understand, the technology to get it all the way to the United States with a guidance system that would be reliable. And it's not crystal clear that they can actually get it up into space and propel it. They have managed to get a satellite in orbit, which takes 3 stages. That's hard technology. You've got to get the first stage up, you've got to ignite the second stage at altitude, got to get the third stage to not blow up. So they're working toward mastering that technology, and they're, I think, getting close. So we may face the prospect of a North Korean ICBM with a nuke on it being a reality sometime within the next administration, if not before. And they're also working on an SLBM, a submarine-launched ballistic missile. Again, they've done the first test, which is to sort of make sure that underwater you can get this thing to come out of a submarine. That's a hard part right there. Getting it then to go to a target is another step, but they've mastered that first, or they at least have successfully tested that first stage. What would that do? Well, that would mean it would be harder to detect where their missiles are. It would mean they could bring a vessel up close to your shore and would not need an ICBM. Now, would they do things with any of these weapons? Who knows? But it would make it much harder to put pressure on them. The threats they would mount would be greater. And fourth, you have to worry about proliferation. These are cash-starved people. This is one of the few things they can sell. Many missile systems in countries we don't like, such as Iran, are based on their no-dong missile, which they sort of a reverse engineered version of the Korean no-dom. True in Pakistan as well with their medium-range missiles. So the idea of them proliferating missile and nuclear technology is not at all a fantasy. So North Korea. What's in the emerging category? Well, China and Russia would be in that category, but you know, these categories, this is the third ring out, they could be interchangeable easily enough. You would put climate change there perhaps, global pandemic. Maybe these things are actually in the urgent category, but to put them somewhere, that's where I put them. I'd like to talk about China a bit, but I think I'm just going to give you one or two thoughts and then move on. The last time I was in China, I had two conversations that were very revealing. I asked a senior member of the party, who we had access to in what's called a track 2 engagement, what's your most important national security threat? And she said, internal development. Pretty smart. In other words, she didn't say bigger weapons, or she said getting things right here in our country. The recognition that the strength of the country is inside, that without that they can't be very powerful. Second conversation was with a former Intel guy walking along the street. At this time, Hu Jintao was still president. So we pass a big portrait of Mao. And I say, so what did you think of Mao? And I got this lecture then, which included this basically. Mao, he created our country. Deng Xiaoping, he modernized our economy. Jiang Zemin, he took us into the world. Hu Jintao is lifting us up. No American would ever say anything like that. So I came away with a sense that they have a sense of progression in their history. If I were to imagine, what would they say about Xi Jinping, that same person? Where would he be in the list? My guess is he would say he's making some necessary repairs. Because what Xi is doing is recognizing, I think, that catch-22 has occurred here. Export-driven economy has made them more prosperous. Wages have gone up. Their goods are less competitive. They have to focus on a consumption-driven economy internally. They have to begin making more rational economic decisions, and to do that, you have to limit bribery and corruption. And that's his anti-corruption campaign. And he's doing this at the same time that he's trying to advance China's power in what it sees as its sphere of influence. More could be said, but I would just leave that there. Russia, I'm just going to set aside because we could talk about it endlessly. And I want to move on to close now with some things that are specific to intelligence as distinct from national security problems. Some things that intelligence has to worry about now and as we approach a next administration, and that a next administration will have to, as they manage intelligence, think about. For intelligence itself, a big challenge is continuing, as we always have, to add high value to what is known. Because we live now in this era where so much information is available, so much open source actually answers so many questions for people. Doesn't mean you don't need intelligence, but what it's going to do gradually is narrow the range of things that intelligence has to focus on. And within that range will be the very hardest things to do. I don't have to tell this audience what some of those things would be, but starting with leadership intentions, which is a continuous struggle in tough parts of the world. So that issue of adding value is gradually changing in a big open source world. We will always need intelligence, but it's going to get tougher to add that value. Second, keeping technology ahead of the curve. Read The $1 Billion Spy, David Hoffman's book, and Burton lived it. But some of the technology that is described in there is more revealing than I thought the agency would ever acknowledge. The SRAC, for example, short-range agent communication device. This was cutting-edge technology back in the 70s. No one else had it, so far as I know. I won't say, you can read the book and see what I'm talking about if you don't know. Point is, today, and always, intelligence has to have technology that's better than what's publicly available because the adversary has all of that. So in a time when technology is changing so rapidly, that challenge has increased for intelligence. I mean, the miniaturization of circuitry is at the heart of this. If you went back to the 1980s and you looked at a microprocessor, it would have 29,000 approximately transistors in it. Today, the average microprocessor has, this is why we have computers in our pockets, has something like 1 billion transistors, and there are people working on microprocessors that will have 8 or 9 billion transistors in the microprocessor, those layers that you see when you look at a microprocessor. So everyone knows how rapidly technology is changing, so the challenge for intelligence is to get ahead of that curve, as we always have been. Third, pushing beyond the traditional collection suite. Back before the invention of the telegraph in 1844, HUMINT was all we had, except for places like France, where since the 16th century the king had authorized the post office to open everyone's mail. But HUMINT was what we had. HUMINT is still essential, of course, and over the time, once we started to move information electronically, then a whole new world opened up, and we developed SIGINT. Then in the 50s, someone had that bright idea to say, what if we could take photographs from space? A paradigm-shifting question. We have that. And we have MAZINT and other things. But we are a little too comfortable with the kind of suite of collection devices based on technology developed in the middle of the last century. So it may be time to ask the paradigm shift question. What is that? The paradigm shift question is, what is it that if we could do it, would revolutionize what we do? What is it that if we could do it, would revolutionize what we do? Because that question then forces you to say, if we could take pictures from space, that's what that question amounted to back in the 50s. What if we could detect nuclear material on a person hundreds of miles from here? What if we could see through metal? I don't know where it takes you, but that question needs to be in the forefront of intelligence minds all the time. And finally, a challenge is building a new relationship with the new administration, What are their expectations? You always have to find this out. I was the transition briefer, if you will, for Bill Clinton, and for part of the time with Bush. And I can tell you, when a new administration comes to office, they come with almost unpredictable expectations, either too high or too low, or with preconceptions they've formed either critically or otherwise. And for intelligence to serve them, that period there, that 3 to 6 month period between the election and their first days in office is a critical time when you figure out, what do we need to do to serve these people? I remember one of my colleagues came back from an early briefing with Bush, 43, big difference between 43 and 41. Came back from a briefing with 43 and said, holy cow, we've been showing him the president's daily brief every day, and he just said, when do I get to see the good stuff? Okay? Those of you who've read the PDD know what I mean. I mean, it is very good, but it is compact. It is primarily, in those days, an analytic product. It is a very high level, sort of a strategic product in most cases. What he meant was, I want to know more about what you're doing operationally. I want to know what happened overnight in Cairo or in Abu Dhabi or Moscow. So it was adjusted for his reading. Obama's a different kettle of fish, I hear. I've only briefed him as a senator. I have not briefed him as president. And finally, maybe a final thing to think about for intelligence. John Brennan alluded to it yesterday at a speech near here. But I've been thinking a lot about this, particularly in the aftermath of Paris. And Jim Comey, the FBI director, has been driving a debate on this since July. What do we do about strong encryption? I don't even understand what that is, other than I can explain it conceptually. I understand it's encryption you can't break, and that perhaps even the owners of it can't break after the message has been sent. But when I know what our cryptologists have been able to do, the miracles they've been able to perform, this must be really strong encryption. So we don't know yet. Someone asked me yesterday, was this involved in the failure to detect the perpetrators of the Paris attacks? I don't know. I don't think we know that yet. But what I do know is that in the aftermath of the Snowden events, that terrorists in particular are very mindful of their communication and taking extra steps to make sure it is secure. So, someone asked me once, I wrote an article in June of 2013, about a month after Snowden's revelations, after he came out. And in that I said, people ask me if this is going to be damaging to intelligence. And I said, to me, that is the ultimate duh question. Of course it is. Everything like that makes our job harder. And because you have hardworking, ingenious, committed people, they overcome it, but it's much harder. I think that's where this strong encryption thing is going to be a big challenge for, I think, the next administration. And they must be thinking about it today as they contemplate what to do about ISIL in Paris. So I'm going to stop there. One could go on about all of this. I would say that if we contemplate a future world, I'll just leave this thought with you. If someone forced me now to go back to the Nick where I once lived and said, write an estimate of what the future world would look like, I would say, I see 3 scenarios: happy world, messy world, and nasty world. And we're probably right now at the low end of messy, in danger of tipping toward nasty. So I'll leave it there.